All right, so we're going to try to figure out how to factor quadratics. So we're going to go put that up here just as our heading. And the first thing we need to know is what is a quadratic. So quadratics have the form general form ax squared plus bx plus c. And so we're going to look at two cases for this. The first of which we're going to say case 1. That's when a is equal to 1. So we're talking about this a right here being 1. If that's the case, then our quadratics now look like this. They're x squared plus bx plus c. So you'll notice that there's just x squared there. So in order to factor these, we are going to follow a series of steps. What we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how we can break this up into a multiplication. So what we want to end up with is something in the form x plus m times x plus n. And again, m and n are just numbers. So we can say m and n just belong to the real numbers, and more specifically, if we're going to factor, they are normally going to belong actually to the integers. They're going to be nice numbers in a sense, but they can be fractions. And so sometimes we're going to go up here, but generally speaking, they are there. So we're going to leave that as real numbers, but generally speaking, I'll put a little star here. We'll say this is normally what happens. Normally we're looking for nice numbers. Sometimes they are fractions. So to factor, the first thing we're going to do with this type is we're going to try to find two numbers, and we've called them m and n, such that, so we're going to say there are some conditions about these two numbers that are going to help us find them. So we're going to say that m multiplied by n is going to give us c, and m plus n is going to give us b. That's what we're looking for. So that might seem a little funny, but once we've found the two numbers, and we'll do an example here in a second, once we found the two numbers, then we're going to factor as x plus m and x, plus n. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to find the two numbers, and then once we do, we're going to write them in brackets. And I'm just going to try to pretty this back up a little bit. So we're going to try to do that again with a nicer, there we go. So for example, if I wanted to factor x squared plus 5x plus 6. So remember, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for two numbers that multiply to give us c. So in this case, we want m times n. We want the two numbers to multiply to give us 6, because that's c. And they have to add up to, m plus n has to be 5. So we need two numbers that multiply to give us 6 and add to give us 5. And there's a couple ways you can do that. Sometimes it's just fairly obvious to people, and that's fine if it is. You know what they are. But what I tend to do, just to start, to make sure we understand what we're doing, is list all the factors of 6. So 1 and 6 are a set of factors of 6, and 2 and 3 are a set of factors of 6. And the only ones then that we have are these two pairs, and we're looking for the pair that adds up to 5. So it's fairly obvious, I think, that that is 2 and 3. So then we say, we write 2, and then we write 3. And that is how we factor. So a fairly simple example, but that's the process that will follow for every single one of these. So if we do another example, let's say I change it slightly. So I'm going to go x squared minus 5x plus 6. So the only thing I've changed is the middle number. But again, we're still looking for two numbers that multiply to give us 6, but they have to now add to minus 5. Which means when we're multiplying, if they're going to add to give us a negative number, then they either both have, and they're going to multiply to give us a positive number, they both have to be negative. So what I'm going to do is, just to make my life easier so I remember, is I'm going to make all these factors negative. Now again, these are the ones that add up to minus 5. But it's really important you look at the sign. So that sign and this sign are going to dictate what happens here. And so then we go, that makes x minus 2 and x minus 3. And we're finished with that one. So what happens then if I have x squared plus 5x, but I have a minus 6? So now I've changed, this was a positive, now it's negative. This was negative and now it's positive. So I still want two numbers that multiply to give me 6, but instead of 6 now it's minus 6. And when you have two numbers that multiply to give you a negative, then they still have to add up to 5. Oops, sorry, let's change that to an n. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So we still want them to add up to 5. So we're going to go m plus n equals 5. So again, we're going to list the factors of 6, but we're going to list them slightly differently, because when you multiply to get a negative, one of these has to be negative. So it's possible that it's 1 and minus 6, or that it's minus 1 and 6, or 2 and 3 with a negative 2, or 2 and negative 3. Those are all possibilities. And what we have to do is then look at all the possibilities and find the one that adds up to 5. And it's this one right here, because 6 minus 1 is 5. So our answer now becomes x plus 6 and x minus 1. So the signs, you can see from that example, the signs make a big difference, because the same numbers were used in all three of the examples that I've showed you. If you look back here, we used 5 and 6, but we had plus 5 and plus 6. If we look here, we had minus 5 and plus 6, and then we had plus 5 and minus 6. And in each case, it changed our result. So we have to be careful of the signs, and the basic idea is, if you look at the general form, you have your x squared term, okay, and your x squared term, I'm just going to actually change this a little bit differently. You have an x squared term, then you have a b value, so you have some sign in here, and then you have some x, so you have bx, and then you have a sign in here and a c. And there's only really two possibilities. This could be plus or minus, and this could be plus or minus. And so what we end up with really is 4 possibilities. We could have plus, plus, or minus, plus. That's a possibility. In this case, okay, because it's positive at the end, both factors, whatever factors you find, have to have the same sign. And they have to have the sign then of the middle number. So we're just going to say they have the sign of the middle number, or of b, if you want to kind of keep with what we've been doing. So we can put a little b in brackets. But what I'll show you, if you go back to your examples, this was minus plus, and then notice they both had the sign of the middle number, which was negative. And if you look at the first one, you had plus here, so they both had the sign of the middle number. Again, they were both positive. So those are 2 of the 4 possibilities. The other option is, again, you could have plus and minus in here, but negative at the end. Now we know from our previous example that if it's negative at the end, the factors have different signs. So one's positive and one is negative. So that is the first thing we know. And then, because we're adding them up, the bigger factor So once you've found your the bigger factor has the sign of b. All right, so if you look back at our second example, because this might look a little confusing, you look back at our second example, or sorry, not our second example, our third example, we had a minus here. So we knew the factors had to be different. They had to have different signs, and we listed them. And then you notice we got 6 and minus 1 to give us 5. So 6 was the bigger factor. It got the positive sign. And if I were to change this, let me just do it with another pen color so you can kind of see what would happen. We do it in red. If I just change this to a minus and left that as a negative, what would happen is this would become a minus and this would become a plus. So all we would do is change the sign of the bigger number to match the sign of the middle number. So this is the general idea. You're looking if you have the sign is positive at the end, the sign of C is positive, and both factors have the sign of that middle number, whatever it happens to be. So essentially they add, and if the factors have different signs, then they're different by this amount. Okay, and so the bigger factor has the sign of B. So that is how you factor. So let's just look at another example, and I think I'm still writing in red, so let's change it back to black, and we'll just say, what about x squared plus 9x minus, making these up as I go along. So minus 9x plus 14. Let's do that. So what I like to do when I approach these is, first of all, I like to look back at what we just talked about and say, what is the situation? The situation in this case is that the C value is positive. So that means we're here. We're in this realm. And if we're in this realm, we know that both factors have to have the sign of the middle number. So what that means is, since the middle number is negative here, I'm looking for the factors of 14. So 1 and 14, but they both have to have a negative in them. And then there's 2 and 7. That's the other possibility. And again, they both have to be negative. And what I'm saying is m times n has to give me 14, and m plus n has to give me minus 9. So I have to look at these factors and figure out which ones add to negative 9, and that one right there is the one that does the trick. So we go x minus 2 and x minus 7. And if you're not sure if you've done it correctly, there is a way to check your answer. It's fairly easy to do. All you have to do to check is expand it back out. So we go x minus 2 times x minus 7 is equal to, hit the button on my pen and it made me right click instead, is equal to x times x. That's the first one we have to do. So x times x is x squared, then x times minus 7 gives me minus 7x, then minus 2 times x gives me minus 2x, and finally minus 2 times minus 7, because it's a negative times a negative, it gives me a positive 14. And if you look, these two factors are the same, they're like terms, so we can add them together and we get x squared minus 9x plus 14, and we say, yep, we're right, because that's the same as what we started with. So that is how you factor basic quadratics. I'm going to stop the video there and get you to practice that.